Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Carnegie Endowment. For those of you I don't know who don't know me, I'm Bill Burns, the president of the Carnegie Endowment. It's nice to see so many familiar faces here today. I really am delighted to be able to welcome back to Carnegie my friend and longtime colleague, Foreign Minister Jaishankar. The truth is that I don't think I ever worked with a more capable professional diplomat than the minister, and I'm delighted that he's been able to make time in what I know is an extremely busy schedule, having survived the diplomatic speed dating of the United Nations General Assembly in New York last week, and now moving into what is familiar terrain for him in Washington, D.C., and which is today a nice, boring, controversy-free zone, to be able to offer his perspective, which is always an extremely thoughtful one, about the evolution of India's strategy on a very complicated international landscape, and then his thoughts on the U.S.-India strategic partnership, which, as all of you know, has deep roots across parties of both administrations over the last couple of decades, and always faces its share of both challenges and opportunities. And so after the minister makes a few opening comments, I'll turn to my friend and colleague Ashley Tellis to moderate the conversation after that. But once again, thanks to all of you for coming. Mr. Minister, it's great
to see you. Thank you. Well, this is very nostalgic, starting 8:30 in Washington at Carnegie Endowment. And I was trying to remember, I think the vivid memory I have is about 5.5 years ago. I had just come into Washington as ambassador. Those weren't exactly the best days for Indo-US relations. And I had an opportunity to speak. I think this was my first formal sort of stop where I spoke. I think, Ashley, you'd sort of remember that. And I thought to myself today how much those 5.5 years have changed. Changed us, changed the US, changed the world, changed our relationship in many years. So what I would do, if it's okay with all of you, is probably speak for about 10 minutes on those changes, if you would. And then I'd really be much happier if I could respond to your observations or your questions, so that I address your interests rather than hold forth on my own. So let me start at home, which is really Modi 2.0 in a way. And I think most of you would not dispute the fact that it was a very impressive election victory. But if we all are fair to ourselves, I think most of us would also admit that we didn't see that coming, certainly not on that scale. And to my mind, the reason is that, I saw two drivers of the verdict. One was a far more effective domestic delivery on many social welfare schemes and socio-economic interventions than people sitting in far-off places, including Delhi, gave the government credit for. And I'd be honest with you, even I, now that I travel more within India, realize how effective and how penetrative those efforts were on the ground. The second, I think, was the national security sense that the world's a difficult place. Our region has been among the more difficult parts of a difficult world. And therefore, a sense that today you need a strong, safe pair of hands to guide national security. So actually, the interesting thing was that while a lot of people suggested anti-incumbency when the elections happened, in reality, you had a government and a prime minister who were still very much perceived as agents of change. What was the first vote in 2015 was a vote of hope. I think the second vote was much more a vote of trust. And it was reflected, interestingly, in actually more numbers. I mean, you had within one election about a 7% increase in the vote share, which is, if you ask any politician, that's not a mean achievement. You had 17 states where the BJP actually got more than 50% of the votes, which is in a Westminster model, a very, very strong statement of confidence. So the fact is that while there were a lot of challenges and clearly, the impact of many moves on society were visible, but it was clear that the electorate in many ways was probably more mature than people gave it credit for. And I say that because if you take the approach of the government in the last 5 years, and I would argue that this carries on, it was very much an approach of a long-term perspective, doing things which are possibly not immediately beneficial, taking tough calls where many of those calls have been ducked. And I think what you see now on 370, Article 370 and the legislative changes in Jammu and Kashmir is very much part of that kind of approach. So that's my sort of broad domestic sort of description for your consideration. So now let's look at the foreign policy. And again, let me speak to you about the last 5 years and then how we take it forward in the next 5. Some of you would remember a movie in the 1970s called Shatranj Ke Khiladi. It was a very famous Satyajit Ray movie, and for those of you who are not familiar, it's these two Indian Nawabs who are busy playing chess as the East India Company relentlessly kind of moves in on India. And the foreign policy takeaway for that is really Indian self-absorption, which leaves you oblivious really to larger global developments. And that's been very much, in a way, a challenge in a large argumentative society which mostly argues with itself. Now, the second sort of legacy, if you would, is really how non-alignment evolved in India, which was that what began really as a statement and a strategy of very fierce independence. Finally, as the world became more complex, it was more and more difficult to do a tightrope walking without offending anybody. So a policy which began really with the intention of maximizing your options ended up as a default position of saying the least and being the most cautious, which has its virtues at times, but often lets pass a lot of diplomatic opportunities. Now that, I think, both the awareness of the world and a willingness to engage and take risks and do things, I think both have changed very sharply. I mean, if you look at the last 5 years, there's been a very active, energetic engagement with actually every major power center. There's been a very vigorous effort made to cultivate constituencies, sometimes regional constituencies, sometimes larger developmental constituencies. But clearly a shift to a very activist diplomatic posture. It's also shown up in activities like HADR, where if you were to contrast what happened in 2004 tsunami, where much of the HADR relief efforts came from outside the region, increasingly actually India has become an HADR provider within the Indian Ocean region and sometimes beyond as well. It's shown up in sharper, I would say, conceptual communication. I mean, there is today a sharp sense of the neighborhood. And when you keep saying neighborhood first, there is a message in it for all the neighbors. When it comes to ASEAN, the emphasis on the act versus the look, again, has a message of greater engagement. The Indian Ocean has a policy called Sagar, which again is a much more integrated, actually for the first time, an integrated Indian Ocean strategy from Australia to Madagascar. And the Indo-Pacific is again an example of a willingness to go beyond traditional silos and accept that the world today is much more seamless than it used to be. But it's not just in the strategic side. I think there is also a sense that, look, today we are the fifth largest economy, fifth, sixth, whatever, and likely to be the third pretty soon. Clearly going to be the most populous country in the next few years. And somewhere our personality, our traditions, our heritage, our voice in many ways needs to be heard perhaps much more effectively than in the past. And there are a range of expressions to that. It could be the International Day of Yoga. It could be the fact that today speeches are given in our own language, conversations are in our own language. It could even be an event like many of you saw in Texas. So the point I'm making is you have a change in India, a generational change, a social change, a political change. You have a set of people who are really much more comfortable in their own skin and who are not today hesitant to engage the world on that basis. Now, looking at the world scenario, I think today we could argue over the reasons for why it is, but I think some of it is pretty obvious to all of us. Clearly the era of benign globalization is over. But it is not to say globalization is over, because there are very deep structural bases for globalization. So you have, in a sense, a structural past contending with a much more nationalistic present. And that tension is playing out very differently in different parts of the world. It is also a fact that today alliances are diluting. So the post-45 world, I wouldn't say the post-45 world is coming to an end, but it is clearly, there is a kind of a transitional phase where the graph is pointing south there. There is an overall rebalancing in the world, economic rebalancing, political rebalancing. And when India looks at all of this, in an interesting way, we come at it from a slightly different direction than many other countries. I think today India is more nationalistic than it was before, but I would also assert India is more internationalist than it was before. And Indian nationalism is not contradictory to, there is actually an appetite for world affairs, which in many other nationalistic societies, it's much more raising the walls and pulling back from where you are. And if I were to, I was sort of trying to find the right words to describe how we approach the world. I would say, in a way, with a high degree of realism, but with also a strong sense of beliefs. Now, in this sort of global background, let me say a few words about some of the major issues, and let me start with India-US relations. Obviously, like every other country, we too are impacted by the repositioning of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world, the fact that it engages in a very different manner than it used to. And the point here is, in a sense, India has an advantage, that not having inherited any of the alliance thinking, it's much easier for us to approach the United States as United States rather than the United States as part of, as the center of a larger Western system. And we, I think today, understand that this is a world of convergences, and you build your cooperation in your areas of convergence. And there are issues, there are even theaters. For example, we could have more convergence east of India than west of India. But there are probably very few places where there are no convergences, very few where there are full convergences. I think where the US, and this is my reading of a American intent, we've always, not always, at least for the last 20 years, seen a debate between those who have a global view and those who have a regional view. And I would argue that if you look back over the last 20 years, it's actually the globalists in the American system who have driven the change for stronger relations. And I think that duality of the United States continues to some extent. The 2-3 big issues which I think form the backbone of our relationship today, I think one is clearly the knowledge economy, and I see that getting stronger, not weaker. Clearly the direction of global economy, the direction of the American economy, the direction of the Indian one, all point towards much more focus on that set of businesses. The Diaspora Connect, I think, has also got stronger, partly due to numbers, but even more due to the quality of the diaspora. And in a sense, today when we approach the relationship, it is very much, would it be a vision-driven progress, or would it be a transaction-driven progress? I think that is, and sometimes, by the way, the two go together. So I wouldn't do it as an either or. But I do think that I know in recent months there's been a lot of writing on the trade issues, but my sense of it is most of these are resolvable. In fact, my expectation is much of it is resolvable in the fairly near term. And I'm overall very confident about both the near-term future and the longer-term future of our relationship. If I could then shift gears and go on to Asia. In Asia, of course, the story of China's rise and how that impacts the rest of Asia, that is still playing out. For India as a neighbor with a somewhat complicated history, I think the search for us is for an equilibrium that would be satisfactory on both sides. It's not easy, an easy exercise, but to my mind, it is a very, very necessary exercise, because it's in the interest of neither country nor indeed the rest of the world that India-China relations are anything other than stable. We made some creative attempts at that. 2 years ago at Astana, there was a understanding, two conceptual understanding. One, that really our relation should be a factor of stability in an uncertain world, and two, that differences should not become disputes. And I must say, other than what happened at Doklam, which is now behind us, we have largely, both of us, lived up to that. And that moved on to Wuhan. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that, these are great problem-solving equations out there. What I am telling you is that India, today India and China have conversations at the leadership level with a degree of candor and an openness which they've not had for a very, very long time. And that, to my mind, has an enormous value, because when you are searching for an equilibrium, unless you have those conversations, you will not get to that equilibrium. So Wuhan, for us, was an exercise in that process, and obviously we hope to take that forward as more informal summits take place. The Japanese relationship is another important relationship. We've really come a very long way with Japan. We see Japan today economically active in India in a manner in which it has not been before. They've also brought to bear a much more strategic view of Asia and our part of Asia in particular. And we've expanded our relationship today to cover security issues, and those of you who have dealt with Japan would really understand, what it takes to actually get there. One word about the ASEAN. I think the ASEAN has actually been sort of the most acceptable platform in Asia, a place where actually much of Asia and a lot of non-Asia meet. And today, strengthening the cohesiveness of ASEAN and maintaining its centrality, these are very important objectives, not just for India, we believe for the larger region as well. Beyond Asia, of course, the two other big factors on our security calculations, one is Europe. Again, Europe has been very inward-looking initially because of the Eurozone crisis, then the challenges that they faced out of North Africa, but then also due to Brexit. But Europe perhaps has not been, shall I say, as much on the change curve in terms of understanding the directions of the world than we would like it to be, particularly in respect to developments in our region. I think that too is changing. We see far more European interest now than we saw a year or 2 years ago. I think both the French and the Germans have been French particularly, have been very much more active out there. Where Russia is concerned, we've always maintained it has enormous geopolitical relevance for us. We have a very strong historical defense security relationship with that country, and that will continue. Overall, as I said, I paint to you a picture really of much greater strategic clarity in Delhi. Yes, I should add one more, which is we have begun, in a way, a much greater focus on Africa. I mean, it's interesting today, 5 years ago, we had, 4 years ago at the India-Africa Summit, committed to $10 billion of lines of credit and $600 million of grant assistance to Africa. We are on track to actually deliver on that and perhaps exceed that in the 5-year period. We had also a training target of 50,000 for 5 years. We've actually done 40. We are opening 18 new embassies in the 3 years. All 18 are going to be in Africa. So out of 54 African countries, I think we'll end up, I forget, 46 or 48 of them. So to sum up, I think there'd be 2 points I would make for your consideration, which is that on the one hand, when we grow, we would like to grow with the world, both politically and economically. So while that may not be true of other parts of this globe, certainly in our case, the message would be of engagement and more engagement. And the second is, there will be a new balance in the making, I mean, which is natural. As any country, relatively and in absolute terms, goes up the ladder, the terms of transaction between that country, that society, and the world will obviously have to reflect that. So I think on a lot of issues, we certainly are clear that the decisions and the courses of action are going to be decided by us. Others can have their opinions on the matter. We would listen to it very respectfully. But at the end of the day, I think the changes which have happened in the last few years would reflect themselves in the manner in which we conduct our foreign policy and the manner in which we engage with other countries. So why don't I stop here and perhaps open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. It's wonderful to have you back here at Carnegie, and thank you for a wide-ranging set of remarks. I'm going to open the floor. Just 2 things to keep in mind. Use your 10 cards if you wish to be recognized, and identify yourself for the sake of the minister. And keep your interventions brief, because I want to get as many people involved in the conversation. So, Puneet.
We take it one by one.
We take it one by one.
Good to see you again, Mr. Minister. I wanted to ask, you hinted at this in your remarks, that there's more convergence to the east than there is to the west. And I'm wondering if you can perhaps tackle for us Afghanistan and Iran. what sort of convergence you see with the United States on those subjects, and then separate from the United States, what India's strategic interests are in those two places, how you see the recent cancellation of the U.S. Taliban talks as well.
The speaker's microphone was not turned on, but the question was a really important one. The question posed by Sriram Lakshman of The Hindu picked up on something the minister said earlier when he remarked, quote, "Somewhere, our personality, our traditions, our heritage, our voice, in many ways, need to be heard, perhaps much more effectively than in the past." In his question, Sriram asked the minister, but whose personality, whose tradition, whose heritage, and whose voice within a very diverse Indian society gets highlighted? Here's the minister's response.
Let me start with Afghanistan, but they're slightly different issues. On Afghanistan, we appreciate that after 18 years, it has become difficult for the United States to maintain the force posture that it has till now. It's not an unreasonable change. In fact, I tell a lot of people at home that frankly it's only the United States which could have even kept that force posture for 18 years. And I think it's also important that our region recognize that in many ways a lot of the good that the US did, and obviously the US did it in its own interest, but we were collateral beneficiaries of what the US had been doing. Now, the issue for us is this. In these 18 years, actually Afghanistan has changed and changed dramatically. Because 18 years is a long time. It's an entire generation plus. There have been huge demographic changes. I mean, people have grown up with knowing only this sort of regime or this system as the larger environment. Political structures have been created. A lot of habits have changed. So the first caution I would enter is for those who analyze Afghanistan and write about it or who make policy on it. The belief that the alternative to today is to rewind 18 years and go back. I think that's a false choice. I think the choice is not between 2019 and 2001 August, okay? Because I think there are a whole new set of realities out there which also need to be factored in. And my sense is it's in our collective interest that those realities be factored in. Now, many of those realities from a common point of view are good realities. I mean, there are things which the US and NATO have created over. Now, those could be physical assets, they could be lifestyle habits, they could be political activity. Now, here again, our point would be, while we understand the need to change the force posture, it would certainly be to everybody's interest that it is done in a way in which much of the achievements of the last 18 years are actually maintained. Now, I understand it's very easy to say this. It's much harder to do it on the ground. I am not impervious to it. But I do think that too is a point which needs to be recognized. Where India specifically is concerned, look, to be very honest, we've been in Afghanistan since Afghanistan existed and India existed. Okay, and so our relations were there before. Our relations will be there afterwards in the sort of large movement of humanity. I mean, this period would be a blip. So we would continue to keep our relationships and our equities there protected. And a lot of those in the last 18 years dovetailed into what the US was doing. But whether that would continue to do so or not depends very much on what the American calls out there are. But do also appreciate our interests there are not, synchronous with yours. You can come and go. You are far away. We can't come and go. We are there, and we will always be there. So the manner in which who we will engage, what we will do, will all have to reflect a much more that sense of permanence that we have vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Regarding Iran, again, there are certain countries, there's that old Churchillian saying about where you stand depends on where you sit. So we view Iran from the East. And our judgments on Iran and our assessments of Iran are very much reflective of that. Those who view Iran from the West may have a differing assessment. That is naturally their privilege. Now, where the U.S. is concerned, our immediate issues, one, of course, we have a political, a societal relationship with Iran. That is something that obviously will carry on. But on the other hand, when it comes to issues like energy, our concern there is the ability to have affordable and predictable access to energy. So a lot of our choices would take that into account. But overall, clearly, we would like, any energy-dependent country, we would like a much greater, faster return to stability and to sort of order in the Gulf. We are concerned at many of the recent developments. We have, by the way, ourselves deployed out there. The Indian Navy is deployed in the Straits of Hormuz as a national deployment to safeguard our tankers and our vessels out there. So we watch what happens there. We talk, just again to give you a sense of our stakes, okay? Out of our 20 top trading partners, 8 are in the Gulf, globally. Out of our, in terms of people, we have 9 million Indians resident in the Gulf. If you look in terms of energy, about 2/3 of our energy is sourced out of the Gulf. If you look at remittances, again, 60% of our remittances come from the Gulf. So if you look pretty much at, any activity today, I think the Gulf is really so salient in the scheme of things that, it's something which gives us a cause for a lot of concern.
Hi, thank you. Nice to see you again. Can you speak a little bit about the role of the External Affairs Ministry and trying to promote economic growth in India? This is something that you've spoken about in other contexts. Obviously, we've seen the growth news for the quarter ending in June. It's not where India would like to be. There have been a kind of a downslope on the economic news, including the unemployment questions. I would think that this would be an issue of top concern for the government as a whole, so it would be interesting to hear how the External Affairs Ministry sees its role in engaging with the world on this question of Indian growth.
Look, nobody disputes that India is a pluralistic society and a pluralistic polity, and in many ways a pluralistic personality. By the way, when I'm talking personality, I'm talking national personality, not a person's personality. Now, because you have multiple voices and different facets, doesn't mean that none of them should be projected. The challenge for us is really, if nobody looks askance at the fact that today the Chinese or the Japanese or the Russians or the Arabs speak in their own language. I'm just using language as an example. So I don't think we need to be defensive or defensive on one side or chauvinistic on the other side about the use of our own metaphors, language, concepts, etc. The larger point I'm making is that if we believe today that we count more, and we count more economically, we count more strategically, we count more politically in terms of activity, that must be reflected in a fairer share of the conversation and a fairer share of the ideas of that conversation. And the examples I cited were to make that point. Certainly, I would say, and the paradox is you and I are having this conversation in English. We could have it in Tamil or in Hindi. But the fact is that it is, I think, natural today for a country in the position in which India is to articulate its ideas, use its metaphors, its language, both literally and conceptually, and introduce those into the international discourse. The idea that our, shall I say, thinking is shaped from the brainwork of other societies, to me, defeats common sense. Certainly at a time when I feel that I am able to pull my own weight so much more effectively than in the past. So I would urge you to look at this not so much in terms of India's domestic discourse, and that domestic discourse will be there in different societies in different ways. I would like you to look at it as part of the rebalancing. Rebalancing is not just in GDP numbers, though the GDP numbers are important. It is also in terms of everything else you do in diplomacy, which gives you that sense that the world is today a much more commonly owned, commonly led sort of enterprise. Alisa, with regard to the role of MEA, look, I'm not the finance minister, I'm not the commerce minister, okay? Neither in terms of responsibility, nor honestly in terms of knowledge. But I will tell you what we do, which is our job in many ways is a sort of a supporting job and partly a leveraging job. We have today, I think somewhere at the end of my remarks made this point about growing with the world. Okay, it's important today that, given our current stage of development, that we have access to technology, capital, best practices in other parts of the world. That my job in MEA is to build those relationships, open those doors. Now, what my colleagues do or what our businesses do going in there is their remit or their capability. But if I can create the larger sort of environment today in which, say, global business is comfortable doing business, there are no non-market barriers to what we seek in other places. I think though some of it is obstacle, some of it is like promotional, some of it is removing regulatory or policy impediments in different places. But we do work very, very closely. And again, I would point to, if you look at a typical, I'm using visit because it's a very handy example. You would see much more, leader X came to India, they looked at city Y for smart city, they committed something to cleaning rivers, they said, okay, let's do this on green energy. So you see much more developmental economic outcomes in international engagements than you did in the past. And that is very much reflective of this mentality of leveraging opportunities much more aggressively than was the case. Of course, in addition, there are trade, there would be a particular example would be trade negotiations where there I think the requirement to work closely with both our commerce and finance would be very much stronger because a lot of trade agreements are also very political.
Thank you, Ashley. Dr. Jaishankar, good to see you again. My question actually, in your opening remarks, you spoke about an activist diplomatic posture and you mentioned the neighborhood, but you didn't elaborate. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how in the last 5 years or going ahead, Delhi sees South Asia. Does it see it from the SAARC perspective, or is BIMSTEC or SASEC more important, more relevant for us? Are we looking more east and less west? And how do you see that progressing? Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Part of the received wisdom in Washington, I think, particularly among those who have served in government, is that the Indian foreign policy bureaucracy is to some degree undercapitalized, particularly in terms of its human resources, that India continues to struggle with following through on its commitments and its ambitions, both to the West and the East and on the global stage. And because you spoke about this government and its role in risk-taking, I was wondering if you could share your vision for the ministry, for the Indian Foreign Service, and for the opportunity for the foreign policy bureaucracy more broadly to rise to a level that allows India to act in a way that's commensurate with its rising global status.
On the neighborhood, look, I'd share with you where we are today with no judgment on what happened before. I think certainly this Prime Minister, this government, I personally believe that regionalizing South Asia ranks right up there in our priorities. And as the largest economy, largest polity, the primary responsibility for that is with us. And I would even go so far as to say, if we have failed in that regard, the primary responsibility for that is also with us. Now, how do you make that happen? You make that happen really by somebody, one going around with very strong advocacy, but then backing it up with the resources which you need to do. So, in a sense, I'm coming to the undercapitalization, but not in the sense in which you meant it. So what we have tried to do over the last 5 years is with each of our neighbors, we have really tried to persuade them that they are better off by doing more with us, not by doing less with us. That that our growth is actually should be seen as a source of prosperity, not as a reason for insecurity. And with every one of our neighbors today, we have very aggressively moved forward on lines of credit and grants and training. I mean, these are our three main tools. But in addition, also encouraging contacts of as wide a variety as possible. If I were to pick really a model case for that transformation, it would be Bangladesh. I have today, and my figures may be a little off, I'm just going by memory. I think the lines of credit that we have committed to Bangladesh alone are in roughly around $8 billion. Okay. And initially what we tried to do was restore a lot of what is in Bangladesh is called the pre-65 connectivity. After the 1965 war, the Pakistanis tore up the roads, the railroads, the waterways. So what was the natural intra-Bengal connectivity was completely disrupted in 1965. But today we are looking way beyond that. So if you actually see what has happened in Bangladesh, you have today there are bus services out there. There are waterways which are operational. We are right now trying to build inland container depots. We supply electricity, so the transmission lines are done. There are high-speed diesel pipelines out there. Interestingly, now the reverse flow has also started because we took the lead. Once they felt secure, they were also prepared to do their part. we have been, we have today the ability to move goods to our northeast through Bangladesh, which previously was something they were not comfortable with. We expect that to source much more gas for our northeastern states out of Bangladesh and out of the port of Chittagong. So our businesses use Bangladeshi ports more, their businesses use our ports more. So what you have purely in terms of infrastructure, connectivity is actually a sea change. And now some of that why I signaled Bangladesh was we also had the big political breakthrough in Bangladesh by settling the land boundary agreement and by reaching an understanding on the maritime boundary. So if I sort of tout a relationship out there, I mean, for very obvious reasons, it is that. But to differing degrees now, we are trying to replicate that with other countries. Every country has its own unique challenges, but this I can tell you that the willingness to undertake projects to really fund them, to give them the technical expertise. And then there's the non-governmental side. I mean, our largest visa issuing operation is in Bangladesh. The number of people who come for medical tourism to India is phenomenal. So number of people who come for tourism is now rising. So if you take that, I mean, that's right now my best case scenario. I'm trying to see if I can do that in Nepal to the same degree to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has, it's not physically contiguous. But in every one of these countries, you would have, I would say, lines of credit, running to many hundreds of dollars today, mostly dedicated to infrastructure projects. So, it all kind of comes under a rubric of neighborhood first, but neighborhood first is not a slogan. It actually is a priority, including in budget. Now, the interesting thing about budget, by the way, is, and that's my bridging remark for is undercapitalization, is our budget has gone up by, I would say, about 25%. Budget started increasing around 2010, okay? But it's gone up very sharply from 2014 on. I mean, if you take a block year, and even this year, I didn't have a complaint. I got pretty much what I hope to get. In terms of the vision of the ministry, look, I would make two observations here. One, the head count, to my mind, is really comparing apples and oranges, because in many countries, who is foreign service is differently kind of defined than how it is in India. So often that number which you get in India for foreign service is perhaps one part of what in the US system, or certainly I know the Japanese or Chinese systems, they would be only one part of it for them. If I were to actually look at the employees of the Ministry of External Affairs, I'm probably looking at what, about 6,000? Yeah, about 6,000 people. Okay. The general number used for the foreign service is 1,000. So, and the reason is that, there are a lot of categories who, for our own internal purposes, we don't define them the way perhaps the rest of the world does. But that's really not the issue. The issue is really an ability to support a larger agenda. Now, what is the larger agenda? I spoke about some of that in reply to Aparna, which is today doing developmental projects is, for me, a very, very major part. In fact, if I were to look at our overall outlay, the bulk of my budget actually goes in support of development projects abroad. You know, in terms of my establishment costs, I'm actually almost budget neutral because what I get from passports and visas as revenue is sort of largely meets my establishment costs. What I would like, the vision that you have is a ministry which is very active in terms of conceptualizing and executing projects abroad, development projects, which is very effective in terms of providing a training as a tool in foreign policy, which actually has a much more, shall I say, questioning culture within the ministry, questioning not in terms of operations and tactics, but questioning in terms of the world and asking yourself fairly regularly, where is the world moving and where am I? Which really means a much stronger, not so much investment in policy planning, but I would say salience to policy planning and people and those associated with it. But the Indian system is also very peculiar because, you know, it's not just in the foreign service that we have less. Oh, by the way, I should make one thing clear. If you're asking me, should we have more foreign service officers, my answer is yes. So that bit, I don't want to confuse you. And particularly as it is being recorded, I don't want to get that wrong. But look, the country also needs more police officers, it needs more revenue officers, it needs more IAS officers. So it's, to my mind, despite our image, we are actually a very under-bureaucratized society. You know, I think the upper levels of the bureaucracy are, you know, the pyramid is like this. You know, it's so the bottom is bigger, but the top is quite narrow. But you got what you got, and you work with it, and you improve it. Now, the way we work with that is you are in many ways a sort of a facilitator and a catalyst rather than an executor yourself. So if you were to say, okay, if you run a training program for 50,000 Africans, how do you do that with 20 people? Okay, I do it with 20 people by actually working with a whole lot of institutions who are never counted under my strength, but I use them in different ways. So if I were to look at my development projects, for example, today I have had to import technical people into the ministry, which I think is very good. They give me the in-house ability to assess projects. But at the end of the day, I use the market. I go to companies, I go to consultants, I go to people who do my DPRs, then I do bids, I harness the ability of industry. So I would say to do more, I would like to obviously grow the ministry, but I would not wait to grow the ministry. I feel even with the way in which we are, we have the ability to do much more things if we are nimbler, if we are more open, if we are more creative in working with other institutions. And so a lot of the vision that I have certainly a vision of a larger, more budget, a ministry with a bigger budget, more numbers, that's fine. But I also have a vision of a ministry with a more open mind, who are willing to work with people outside the foreign service, outside the foreign ministry, outside the government, in order to actually get more things done.
So, Minister, prominent media outlets sort of in the US, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, have been fairly relentless critics of your government and the BJP and the Prime Minister. Why do you think it's the case? And do you think it sort of matters for you?
Indo-US relations have taken a downturn after the previous two presidents. With the number of trade disputes, security issues that have come up, are much worse now. 3 years of this is over. The question is, there is talk about striking a deal with the USA on trade, and our fellows have felt we are under pressure. Do you settle now, or say, why don't we hold out one more year, just in case there is another president, and then settle then? In other words, should we take a hard line on saying, we don't settle just because some time has passed? Let us wait. Maybe we have to deal with this guy anyway, but maybe there is somebody else.
Devesh, if I just want to make sure I understood your question. Your question is that we get, the BJP and the Prime Minister get criticized in media. You cited an example, and how would I respond to that? Did I get that right? Okay. Look, there's a lot of change happening in India. There's a lot of change happening in the world. And in many ways, they kind of feed into each other. It's not that India is, today, everybody is on the same page and there are no arguments or disputes in India. It's also quite evident that in many ways, a lot of our arguments within the country are reflected in global arguments of a different nature. So I take a lot of what our media comments and media analysis as reflecting the thinking, the viewpoints of different media organizations. When I'm at the negative end of it, I would regard it as a bias. Obviously, if it works in my favor, I'd say, insightful guys, they got it right. So now, I give you an example. Look at all that has come out on 370. Okay, it's almost impossible to find anywhere in global media one reference to the fact that 370 was a temporary provision of the Constitution, because it's inconvenient to the narrative which they are advancing. So let's not kid ourselves. The world is an ideological place. Okay, people. Not everybody is as fair, as objective as we would like them to be. Perhaps we ourselves are not. So I think it's, we take what comes from different quarters and then kind of assess, okay, who is saying that? Well, when you see who's saying it, you shrug your shoulders and you move on. So I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I think at the end of the day, certainly in a society like India, the caravan would move and people will do what they have to do. Swami, your issue on trade disputes. Look, I have a larger concern, and the concern is this. In India, there is an inclination to put off decisions even otherwise. No longer. So I would, the moment somebody comes and says, look, why are you doing it now, push it off. No, I'm not saying timing doesn't matter. Okay, so I take that. I mean, in our business and diplomacy, timing is very critical. But I would not, I would say, as a default position, kick my problems down the road, because then they tend to accumulate. And certainly on the trade side, we've seen that over many, many years, that, there are issues, which I remember from 20 years, which are still being debated in many ways. So maybe it's just me, but I would certainly advocate that if we have issues, I would like to engage, I would like to sort them out. I would not like to hold on to them and say maybe the world will be better tomorrow. Because my own sense is a year down the road, there'll be more issues. There'll be things we haven't foreseen today. So I would very much, and I think we have a backlog to deal with as well. I mean, there are legacy issues. There are issues we've been debating for the last few years. So I wouldn't, my inclination would be contrary to what you are saying, that irrespective of what happens in the American elections, I feel if there are issues which can be settled today, I would rather settle them today.
Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to ask you a question on Jammu and Kashmir, which I'm surprised didn't come up until you yourself brought it up. It's been about 60 days since the abrogation of 370, and the government is on record as basically laying out three objectives. One is to create a new political leadership that is aligned with the so-called sort of idea of India. The second is to create a vibrant economy that delivers for the local population, and to do so in a way that is consistent with, the rule of law, providing security and stability. I wonder if you could give us a roadmap about how we get from where we are today to how we get to those three desired end states.
You mentioned that the era of benign globalization is ending, and you also talked a bit about the importance of your relationship with the Americans. So I guess my question is, given that the Trump administration is very much leading this change of globalization, arguably deglobalization, and takes a very sort of transactional, bilateral view of foreign affairs, to what extent does the character of globalization, the character of relations between countries, come into your conversation with the Trump administration? Because I presume from your wording, benign is over, that you saw it as benign. There are some good things about the kind of globalization that is receding.
Okay. On Milan, your issue, look, I would first of all differ with what you said in terms of our objectives. I don't think the objective is to promote a political leadership. I forget whatever words you use, because I think the leadership of any state or set of states would come from the leadership. So it's not that Delhi is going to say, well, these are the guys we like or not like. But I'll tell you what are the, in a sense, the objectives, or I'll give you sort of a broad explanation. Look at where we were on August 5th. Okay. After 70 years, after the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, and about 30 years of what has been a fairly high-intensity cross-border terrorism waged, which has disrupted pretty much the fabric of the state. There were limits to how much you could progress out there, because particularly the last few years, you had a lot of new elements to the challenges out there, including the emergence of much more radical fundamentalist ideologies and people bearing weapons in that name. You also had actually a social, and if I were to give you a little history here, it's very interesting. Just so that I have you all on the same page. Article 370, the temporary Article 370, provided for the issue of presidential proclamations by which national laws then became applicable to the state. Now, over a period of time, initially the 1950s and 60s saw a very large number of these. These started trailing off. Now, if you were to actually do a correlation, you do a correlation between the alignment of Jammu and Kashmir to the national laws of India and the terrorism and the law and order status of Jammu and Kashmir, I would suggest to you, you'll find a very, very strong correlation out there. So the problem was that you had a state which actually, as India progressed, was more, was less and less aligned with India in every sense of the term. I mean, some of it could have been political, institutional, and administrative, but a lot of it was social and economic as well. I mean, as people know, a lot of the right to work, the right to information, the right to education, the reservations, these things, none of these provisions applied to Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, if you looked at the representative sample of any legislation which was passed by the parliament, fairly high up, page 1, maybe para 2 or para 3 you would have, but this law applies to all of India except the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So I would surely, from a common sense point of view, if you are, in a day and age where every society is undergoing change, hopefully for the better, the idea that one state remains unaligned, that every time it has to do its own thing, which it didn't do a lot of it. I mean, if they were doing it on their own and keeping in step, it was a different matter. But you look pretty much at anything progressive, anything to do with women, anything to do with children, anything to do with property, anything to do with affirmative action. I mean, in fact, the irony, Devesh, is everything which the liberal press thinks is good for the world was not happening in Jammu and Kashmir. And yet people wanted to defend the provision which was blocking that good from happening. I mean, look at the absurdity of it. So the point is that there is a fundamental issue of governance in a way at stake here. How long do you continue what was meant? I mean, and a fair reading of the Constituent Assembly debates. I mean, nobody has to take my word or that of the government. I mean, these are today all available on the net. Read the Constituent Assembly debates. Look at the correspondence of that era. Look how much even the temporary, the original draft of 370 was 306A. But 306A was initially much more ambitious than what 370 happened to be. So there was a trade-off at that time, saying, okay, we'll accept a more limited alignment, but it will be temporary, and over a period of time we will align. Now, we have moved away from that. And I don't want to cast aspersion on the people, but we all know why that happened. I mean, there were considerations of various kinds at play. So today, I think somewhere somebody had to take a call, saying, enough of this, and let's find a more, shall I say, more a bolder. I accept. I mean, it's not without its risks, but the goal is towards de-radicalized Jammu and Kashmir rather than a more radicalized Jammu and Kashmir, and I think those were our options. So on the globalization, my use of the word benign was that it was viewed benignly, rather than is globalization benign or not benign. By the way, I don't think globalization is malign. Okay, so let me be on record out there. So, in fact, my own sense is globalization is there to stay. You can modulate it, you can sort of alter it here and there, but fundamentally the idea that, in this day and age, economies would be primarily national, I think is a very, very, or mobility should not be allowed, or that, interpenetration of economies can be controlled. I mean, all those, I think there are realities out there. But the point I was making was, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have even argued over this point, because everybody more or less accepted this is the direction the world is moving. Today, we are arguing over that point. And I mean, whichever side of the argument I am on, I cannot be in denial of the fact that there is an argument, and I have to factor it into my calculations.
I have abused the minister's indulgence for at least 15 minutes beyond the time that we had scheduled, and I know that there are still desired interventions from the floor, but I apologize to all of you because the minister has a busy schedule. I'm deeply grateful, though, to Dr. Jaishankar, not simply for coming to Carnegie. Of course, he is welcome here anytime, but because he took the pains to actually answer every question that was posed to him, and did it with the justice of both a political figure as well as an academic. Took the question seriously, addressed the question seriously. I hope we will have an opportunity to welcome you back. You're always welcome. And I hope we will be able to continue this conversation, both to those present here and to others who may visit the Carnegie Endowment. So on behalf of all of you, I want to thank you, Minister Jaishankar, for coming here, and I want to thank you all for coming relatively early in the morning. It's a Washington phenomenon. Get up and come to a meeting at 8:30. And I look forward to seeing you again here at some point in the not too distant future. So thank you all very much. Take care.